89% of organizations that suffered a SaaS breach last year believed they had appropriate visibility at the time. And most of them had logs, but what they didn't have was alerting on what mattered. Well, today we're digging into the breach that put that gap on display and what it actually takes to close it.
Welcome to ShadowTalk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Brandon Tirado, Director of GreyMatter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today we're talking about why your cloud integrations are probably less secure than you think.
So John, the Vercel story just broke on Sunday and it's all over the news. It's the same story we keep seeing with these third-party and supply chain risk incidents.
Yeah, it really is, Brandon. And what strikes me about this one is that Vercel didn't get compromised in the traditional sense of phishing emails or vulnerability exploitation. You know, their infrastructure wasn't exploited for initial access, but rather through a third party.
An employee signed up for a third-party AI productivity tool using their enterprise account, granted it broad permissions, and that tool then got compromised. And suddenly, Vercel's internal data is on sale for $2 million on the dark web.
And really, that high-level attack pattern of threat actors breaching widely used tools and achieving third-party access, it's the standard playbook for groups like ShinyHunters. Compromise one integration, and hundreds of downstream tenants are exposed.
And the number from the SalesLoft drift breach, 700 organizations exposed through that one tool, is what should make every security leader pause and ask, if a SaaS tool my team authorized gets hit or compromised tomorrow, would I even know?
Yeah, and the tough answer to that question is that most don't. But the really wild thing here is that the logs exist for most organizations. The evidence is there, but the question is whether the detections are built around it.
Yeah, and that gap between having some logging and having detections ready to fire on the right behavior before damage is done is where the most breaches go unnoticed. And that's exactly what we're getting into today. So John, let's make sure our listeners understand exactly what happened here. Walk us through the Vercel incident to kick us off here first.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me set things up for our listeners. So to start, if you don't know, Vercel is a cloud platform as a service, or PaaS, that's designed for front-end developers to build, deploy, and host websites and applications. And what makes a compromise like this particularly concerning is that the primary risk here isn't limited to the platform itself or Vercel itself. It's the potential for the downstream impact on third parties that are connected either directly or indirectly to Vercel. So the Vercel compromise likely started with a Luma Stealer infection on a Context.ai's employee's machine. And so for some more information, Context.ai is an AI workflow productivity tool. And one of its features is deep integration with Google Workspace on behalf of its users, including Vercel. So the info stealer harvested a Context AI employee's corporate Google credentials, which then gave the attackers access to Context.ai's internal environment. And from there, the threat actors leveraged an OAuth integration between Context.ai into Vercel to pivot into Vercel's infrastructure. And a really important note here is that this was a legitimate trust relationship that was originally authorized by a Vercel employee. At no point did the attackers need to touch Vercel directly. So the attacker accessed customer environment variables inside Vercel's platform. And separately, a threat actor then appeared on breach forums, claiming to sell stolen data, including Vercel's employee credentials, API keys, NPM and GitHub tokens, and their source code. That threat actor on breach forums claimed affiliation with the group ShinyHunters and asked for a $2 million payment for the data. However, it's important to note that individuals of ShinyHunters have publicly denied involvement in the attack. With that being said, tactics are still consistent with what we've seen ShinyHunters do in documented previous attacks. For example, the recent compromise of Anodot, which was a SaaS application that helps monitor for outages.
Yeah, and John, just to restate, the real concern isn't what happened to Vercel. It's happening. It's what really happens next year. A compromise like this doesn't just stop at that vendor. It's cascading it down to their customers, and that's the same pattern we saw here with that anecdote example that you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to bring it back to that anecdote compromise, threat actors were able to steal sensitive data downstream from at least a dozen other organizations. And this even got to big organizations like Rockstar, for example. And to that point, too, the playbook that we're outlining here is really becoming bread and butter for many groups like ShinyHunters. So, Brandon, I'll pass it over to you. Can you explain why this playbook of cloud applications has become a major target?
Yeah, John. So really the economics have flipped, and they flipped a long time ago, but hitting one SaaS tool gets you hundreds of victims, right? Hitting one enterprise network is going to get you one environment. If you're a financially motivated group, that's not even a decision anymore, right? You go where that multiplier is. And really the first driver that is, causing all this is, again, that reach that these threat actors have. If you were to breach a widely used platform and you inherit every organization that essentially is connected to it, steal the data, extort downstream victims, repeat, it's really a distribution channel, not necessarily a target.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, this is the ShinyHunters playbook. For example, credential abuse at Snowflake, OAuth compromise at SalesLoft and Drift, and now OAuth supply chain at Vercel. There's different mechanics each time, but it's the same group, the same thesis. Get into a tool that a lot of companies trust and steal downstream data.
Exactly. And so now, like on that second point, right? So data exfiltration from a widely used platform or software is just easier than a full network compromise. And when I say easier, what I really mean is that this model is just more efficient to execute, right? Deploying ransomware on an enterprise is, a dozen stage attack chain. I got to get initial access. I got to move laterally. I might got to steal some more credentials, maybe unhook an EDR, destroy backups, etc. Every stage is a place defenders can catch the adversary. Hitting a cloud tool collapses most of that. Logging in with stolen credentials and just pulling the data, and the adversary is done. That same outcome, a fraction of the work, a fraction of the risk, is really what's appealing here. And so that's the attacker side, right? On the defender side, two gaps explains why we keep seeing this and why this keeps landing. And that first part is logging, and not in the way most people are thinking. It's not that these logs don't exist, right? It's that coverage is uneven, and that unevenness is what's creating false confidence. A security team has say their Microsoft 365 logs feeding into detection, alerts are tuned, content is well built. That source is essentially flawless. It's humming. But when senior leadership, ask about visibility related to these SaaS applications, the answer is yeah, of course we have the logging. It's all there. And the problem with that is that the likes of a Salesforce tenant or the Workday instance, the 30 other SaaS applications and tools that the business is actually running on, those sources are either not connected, they're partially connected, or connected without any detection logic layered on top. And one strong source is, carrying that whole picture. And that assumption is that the rest of the coverage looks the same. And in reality, it doesn't. The second part here is, conditional access. And this is where the most, people I'd say are oversimplifying it. It's not one policy. In a chain like this in particular, there's at least 3 distinct layers where scoped access policy can break the attack. When first, right, the OAuth grant is made. Second, when that stolen token is later used. And then thirdly, when that attacker pivots into internal systems. Each one lives in a different admin console, often configured at various points in time for, various different reasons. And even mature programs rarely review them as one connected defense. And attackers know that. So essentially, you can have the tools, the policies, and the logs, and still have a gap an attacker walks straight through. When we come back, what actually closes that gap? And the answer isn't more tools.
ShadowTalk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, GreyMatter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Alrighty, and we're back. So before the break, tools, policy, logs, still being a gap. We had mentioned that this still isn't enough. So John, I'm curious for you, can you break down what's the actual visibility problem here, right? I feel like we've been talking around it. So let's get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, certainly. And picking back up on your conversation before the break. So the issue here isn't really whether the logging exists. It's whether the right data is getting to the right place and whether anyone's built detections on top of it. And we see this across our customer base, right? So like thinking about that golden standard of a log source, usually Microsoft 365 comes to mind. It's usually the most mature, right? Visibility is generally strong, detections are live, and response windows are tight. It's not always complete, but it's definitely the closest that most organizations get. Then you start looking at tools like Salesforce, Workday, and the rest of the SaaS estate. Again, the platforms that ShinyHunter is actively targeting. And that's where the visibility drops off, which puts everyone involved in a tough spot. We built the detections for these exact attack patterns. The content is tuned and the response actions are ready. But without the visibility available, none of it has anything to fire on. We nor our customers can operationalize what can't be seen. And this isn't us just making a case for ourselves. External research backs this up too. And I really want to draw our listeners in here to pay attention. Put down what you're working on the side for a moment and just really listen to these next few stats because they are really eye-opening to the problem we're trying to outline here. So 75% of organizations had a SaaS-related security incident last year. But the number that should really stop every security leader is that 89% of organizations that suffered a SaaS-related breach believed they had the appropriate visibility at the time. So they thought they were covered, but they weren't. And only 43% of organizations are doing continuous or near real-time SaaS monitoring. The rest are running periodic audits, which really means that you find out about the breach on a schedule, not when it's actually happening.
Yeah, and which is a problem, obviously, right? When the average breakout time, again, we talk about it almost every episode, but that window between initial access and an attacker actually moving laterally, being 34 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to be specific there, that's the window where detection and response is most critical. Exfiltration itself can happen in minutes, but really once that data is leaving, you're in containment mode. The damage has already been done. So that real detection window is that breakout, when the attacker is still pivoting from one system to the next. And that's exactly where this falls apart because it ties back to the main point you made earlier. So those controls and logs live in different admin consoles, right? Salesforce is in one place, Workday's in another, Microsoft 365 in a third. That's a heterogeneous enterprise, and it's not wrong. It's just how modern companies are built. But if you've got 34 minutes to stop lateral movement across all of them, you can't be logging into each console to piece the story together. Signals have to be correlated as they come in across sources in real time. Otherwise, that breakout happens and you're stuck writing the post-mortem. All right, Brandon, so passing it over to you. We mentioned that cloud visibility wasn't the only challenge for defenders here. Can you walk us through what other defenses can be put in place?
Yeah, John. So I look at this and see, three glaring recommendations that kind of come directly from the Vercel breach, because there were three distinct layers when looking at this where a properly configured policy could have potentially broken that chain. And so that is the first layer here, right? And it's the highest leverage one, is that the OAuth grant itself. Google Workspace admins can restrict which third-party apps users are allowed to authorize. A trusted app list, scope-based restrictions, admin approval required before any new grant goes through is critical. In an environment running that policy, a third-party app can't receive a refresh token without admin sign-off. So no approval, no refresh token, and that chain never even starts. That's a native platform control, and it's no additional tooling required. And this is the layer that breaks the attack before any credentials are ever, at risk in the first place. Most orgs know that control exists, but the honest, answer or reason as to why that this is still at place is the convenience factor for security. Every new OAuth grant is then becoming an IT ticket. Production teams are going to push back. And over time, that control gets loosened and sadly sometimes just turned off entirely. Now, the second layer here is where things get technically nuanced. And I want to be precise though, right? Traditional conditional access was built for human sign-ins, right? Device trust, location checks, MFA, et cetera. But when an attacker is using a refresh token, context AI had been storing, they're not doing an interactive sign-on anymore. They're making back-end token exchanges directly with Google. And most conditional access policies don't apply to that path the way that they would say, for a interactive logon with a user logging in from a new laptop. But what does apply is a different class of control here. Scoped restrictions limit what the app can do, even if it gets compromised. Say a token, in this case from Context AI, only gives the attacker the scopes the app originally had, no full account control, etc. App access policies lets admins disable the app across the tenant in one action. An anomaly detection on app behavior, say an app suddenly reading thousands of emails from a new ASN, can trigger and in this case, revoke the actual token itself. So the lesson here is that once the refresh token is out the door, you're not in this conditional access policy world anymore. You're in a detect and revoke type world. The third layer that I'm going to talk about here is Vercel's own identity provider, that single sign-on layer. So when the attacker pivoted from the compromised Google account into Vercel's internal systems, that pivot required an actual authentication event. And that's where full conditional access comes back into play here. So a conditional access policy at the IDP level, say, again, Okta, Entra, wherever single sign-on lives, could have required a managed device for an admin console access, set up through, to have MFA before even reaching customer data, or say an IP allow list on internal dashboards. Any of those kind of breaks this pivot, even with a fully compromised Google account. So this is also where corporate versus BYOD matters most. If you're an admin console, or if your admin consoles require, say, a managed compliant device, an attacker on their own infrastructure with valid credentials never gets in, no matter how good, again, the credentials that they've obtained are from the start. So let's close this out with what organizations actually do with everything we've just covered. And I want to start on the leadership side. Then, John, we'll have you bring it home here from the practitioner level. For security leaders, the headline from this episode is a question you need to answer, not eventually, but right now. Who controls which third-party applications are authorized against your enterprise data? Because if the answer is individual employees, you have the same exposure that led to the Vercel breach here. Every OAuth grant to an enterprise account creates a new trust relationship. Refresh tokens, persistent API access, data flowing to a third party you didn't vet. Now, that's not a decision to leave with end users. It's a security decision, and it needs to be governed centrally. The second priority is treating OAuth governance as a formal category of risk. It's not a IT hygiene task anymore. Employees are connecting AI productivity tools to enterprise accounts faster than organizations can even track. And prohibition here is not the answer. That's just how you create shadow IT at scale. And what you need is a documented OAuth governance policy with 4 specific controls. an admin approval workflow so no third-party app can receive an enterprise account grant without review, an allow list of pre-vetted apps for common workflows, scope-based gating, so sensitive permissions like a mailbox read or drive access or directory access always triggers admin review regardless of the app, and periodic recertification, so stale or abandoned grants get revoked. That policy doesn't require a new technology. It requires a decision. So that morning action for the leaders listening, open your identity provider's app governance settings. Google Workspace, Microsoft Entra, or whatever platform fronts your enterprise accounts, and pull the list of third-party OAuth applications currently authorized. Then ask one question. How many of those grants were issued directly by end users without admin review? Every one of those is an uncontrolled trust relationship with your data. That's your starting point.
Those are some great recommendations, Brandon, for the security leaders. Let me bring it home for the practitioners here. So really the core issue is this. You can't detect what you cannot see. And right now, most organizations have a blind spot specifically at the SaaS and cloud integration layer. So the telemetry that would have surfaced this type of compromise, things like API call volumes, consent events, data access attempts, it's technically available in most environments. But the question is whether it's operationalized. And often it's not turned on, it's not retained long enough, or it's scattered across admin consoles that don't talk to each other. Again, collection isn't the issue, correlation is. So it's not a tooling failure, it's a coverage failure. And really, that's exactly what that 75% SaaS incident rate is telling us. There's one more piece worth flagging here, especially as attackers start running parts of this playbook with AI assistance. So enumeration and lateral movement are compressing. And the reconnaissance phase that used to take hours or days now happens in minutes because the attacker has an AI model enumerating resources in parallel and deciding what to pull next. So what this really means is if your detection rules were tuned on a dwell time or velocity thresholds from incidents a few years ago, they may not fire on what the current threat actually looks like today. So it's worth revisiting detection thresholds on three things specifically. The first being how fast unique resources are being enumerated inside a single session. Second, how quickly failed access attempts start converting to successful ones, which is a signature of automated probing. And then finally, how much variety in data types shows up in a short time window. These are all signals of AI accelerated attacks that they leave, and they don't look like the attacks our rules were originally written against. So your morning action for practitioners, what you can do tomorrow morning, go to your highest value SaaS platform's admin console. Again, those tools like Salesforce, Workday, or any platform that hosts sensitive business data. You need to confirm that the audit trail is active, retained, and being surfaced somewhere your team actively reviews them. Your SIM, your SOAR, your data lake, monitoring platform, it really doesn't matter where it lands as long as it lands somewhere connected to detections. Then check whether you have active alerts built around new OAuth grants, access attempts from unfamiliar sources, and anomalous data retrievals. If any of those are a no, then you have your starting point.
Awesome. I love it, John. So really, the bottom line from everything we covered today, SaaS security isn't a question of whether logging is enabled or conditional access policies exist. It's whether your coverage actually reaches the places attackers are exploiting now. The third-party apps, the OAuth grants, the integrations, nobody formally signed off on. If your defenses stop at the systems your team deployed, ShinyHunters already knows exactly where to start. That's all for this week. Thanks again for listening to another episode of ShadowTalk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions over to ShadowTalk@ReliaQuest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review ShadowTalk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.